The first sign that Order 66 had failed was not mercy. It was confusion. On Utapau, the afternoon lay in pale layers of dust and glaring sun, the sinkholes full of shadow and cool water far below. The old city built like a hive into the bones of the world. The battle had ended with a kind of exhausted violence. Droids were falling silent. Smoke trailed from broken emplacements. The air was thick with the taste of scorched metal and limestone grit, and the men of the 212th, who had spent so many months learning how to move as if one will beat in all their chests, were finally beginning to believe they might live through the day. Cody stood on the landing platform with a macro-binocular unit lifted halfway to his eyes and a helmet speaker hissing at his ear. He had only moments earlier pressed a lightsaber hilt back into Obi-Wan's hand with the absent relief of a man returning a borrowed pistol before someone noticed it missing. It had felt ordinary then, almost laughably ordinary. The kind of passing gesture that only soldiers understood as intimacy. There were whole campaigns in that gesture. Mud dot. Rations split in darkness. Shellfire. Orders spoken without looking because each already knew how the other thought. The signal came on a private channel wrapped in the black seal of supreme authority. He answered out of reflex. Cody here. What came back was a voice he knew, but not as a soldier knew a commanding officer. It was more intimate than that and colder, arriving like a blade inside the skull rather than a sound in the ear. The time has come. Something hid behind his eyes. Execute. The transmission fractured. Static scraped across the syllables. The rest of the sentence arrived in pieces, like glass grinding in a metal throat. Jedi have. Traitors. Protocol. Order. Pain drove a white seam through his head. Around him, 3 troopers reeled with identical violence. One dropped to a knee and fired his weapon straight into the Duracrete without meaning to. Another tore off his helmet with such force, the clasp snapped and skittered across the platform. A third stood rigid, rifle half raised, tears pouring down his face in naked animal confusion. Cody's hand went to his temple. Something older than conscious thought, something installed deeper than memory, seized his nerves and tried to close them around a single imperative. Destroy the Jedi. It did not come as an idea. It came as necessity so absolute it felt like gravity had been revised. His mouth opened before his mind could shape words around what his body knew it had to do. Across the gap, Obi-Wan rode Boga along a high ridge, his robe snapping at the hem, one hand resting easy on the Varictal's neck. He had that look he sometimes wore between battles, alert and faintly amused, as if the galaxy were forever trying to surprise him and had not yet managed it. He lifted a hand in greeting toward the platform. Cody tried to return the gesture. What came instead was a ragged half-signal that looked like a man swatting away a stinging insect. The first blaster bolt missed by a body length. Obi-Wan turned before the sound reached him. The Force did not warn him with a clean line of danger. It flooded him with broken intentions. Murder, terror, pleading, static. He saw one clone in the emplacement fire with full commitment, another slap his muzzle aside at the last second, a third stare at his own trigger finger as if it belonged to somebody else. Boga screamed and lurched. A heavy cannon discharged from the lower shelf, with enough force to crack the support stone beneath the ledge. "Cease fire!" Cody heard himself shout. At the same instant, just as loudly and in the same voice, he heard himself roar, "Take him down!" Men obeyed both. A sheet of bolts crossed the air. One clipped the Varactal's flank. Another exploded against the wall behind Obi-Wan. The stone under Boga's clawed feet sheared away. Obi-Wan dropped sideways out of the saddle with the instinctive precision of a lifetime of impossible falls. But there was nowhere to land except emptiness. Animal and rider plunged together through a spill of shattered rock into the sinkhole below. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Even the smoke seemed to hang. Then the platform erupted. Troopers shouted over one another. A sergeant seized the barrel of a cannon and swung it wide before it could fire again. The man aiming it butt stroked him hard enough to crack visor and cartilage. One private vomited inside his helmet and ripped it free, gasping and sobbing. Another turned his blaster on a comrade whose chip had driven him into a shaking frenzy, and both men froze with weapons aimed, unable to decide whether the traitor stood in front of them or behind their own eyes. Cody dropped to one knee, palms against the duracrete, fighting for breath. The order had not vanished. It was in him still, grinding against every memory that did not fit it. It told him the Jedi were enemies. It told him the hesitation of his own men was corruption. It told him that the man falling into the depths below was a target, not a general who had shared canteens and casualties and impossible victories. But it did not fit cleanly. Something in the signal had broken on the way in. The command kept splitting against images his mind refused to surrender. Obi-Wan standing unarmed between civilians and artillery on Christophsis. Obi-Wan crouched beside a dying clone on Salakami, speaking to him as gently as a brother. Obi-Wan accepting the returned lightsaber with a tired nod that trusted Cody absolutely. The chip drove pain through him until black specks danced at the edges of his vision. "Sir," one trooper whispered. Cody looked up. The man's face was bare, pale with sweat beneath a close-shaved scalp. Blood ran from one ear in a thin line down his neck. "What are we doing?" Below, somewhere in the shadows of the sinkhole, there came the deep splash of something large striking water. Cody rose too fast and the world swayed. "Search teams," he said, and hated how hoarse he sounded. "Confirm the kill." Another pulse of pressure squeezed behind his eyes, punishing him for the shape of the words. Confirm the kill was not the same as target eliminated. The distinction was tiny. The agony it bought him was not. A lieutenant stared at him, suspicious through his visor. "Sir, Chancellor's order is explicit." I heard it." "Then why aren't we firing everything we have into that hole?" "Because the word explicit had arrived torn to pieces. Because half the battalion had nearly turned their weapons on each other before the general vanished from sight. Because something in Cody's mind was telling him to murder a man he trusted while another thing, just as deep, stood in the doorway and refused to move. Because the galaxy had tilted and no one yet knew which way was down. "Because," he said with clipped brutality, "I want a body." That was soldier's language. Was certainty. It pacified the lieutenant enough to make him snap a salute and begin barking assignments. Cody stepped to the lip of the platform and looked into the vast throat of Utapau. The shadow below was streaked with light and full of drifting mist. Far beneath, he could see ripples widening across dark water. No body surfaced. He should have felt satisfaction. He should have felt the chips settle into a single hard purpose. Instead, he felt only the horror of a man who has thrown a friend from a cliff and cannot even claim the clarity of obedience in his own defense. Far below, cold closed over Obi-Wan like an opened grave. The fall stunned him, but the water saved him from the rock. He went under with the Verectal twisting beside him in a blur of striped limbs and streaming blood, the world reduced to shock and darkness, and the giant booming echo of cannon fire above. Training seized him where thought could not. He kicked free of the saddle tangle, found stone, found up. Before he broke the surface, he felt it at last in full. A ripple through the force so vast it might have been mistaken for the death of an era. It was not death. Death was in it, yes. Sharp, bright, abrupt lights being stamped out on worlds scattered beyond counting. But woven through those extinctions was resistance. Intended murder shivered and faltered. Bonds strained and snapped. Whole companies of men turned their rifles on teachers they had followed for years, and then, in the same heartbeat, found themselves unable to understand why their hands were shaking. Across the galaxy, the force filled with broken oaths, fractured commands, bewilderment so intense it almost sounded like prayer. Obi-Wan surfaced beneath an overhang and dragged in breath tasting of minerals and old water. Above him, tiny as toys against the ledges, clone troopers swarmed the rim. He heard distant shouting carried strangely down the stone. Not disciplined volleys. Arguments. Boga surfaced near him, thrashing weakly. Obi-Wan put a hand to the creature's neck, soothed her as best he could, and the contact sent another surge of feeling through him. Fear. Pain died. Loyalty. Not treachery, not cleanly. The Varactyl had no word for treason. She only knew that trusted voices above had become the voices of hunters without warning. He pressed himself into the shadow and reached upward through the force, seeking not one mind but the wound itself, the shape of the catastrophe. It was everywhere. Kashyyyk burned green around a bright, ancient flame that had not yet gone out. A star destroyer above Mandalore became a sealed chamber of red alarms and conflicted soldiers. The city planet at the center of the Republic glimmered like a crown full of knives. Obi-Wan closed his eyes. He had spent his life training for the day the Sith moved against the light. He had imagined ambushes, armies, hidden blades in Senate corridors, dark rituals and forgotten ruins. He had never imagined that the instrument would be loyalty itself, turned by some buried mechanism against the men who had trusted it. Above, a blaster fired. Another answered from the wrong direction. Obi-Wan opened his eyes to the dark water and understood that whatever Sidious had just set loose, it had not gone according to plan. On Kashyyyk, the trees heard the betrayal before the men did. Their trunks held the day in layers of old resin and warm sap. The platforms of Kashyyyk clung to them like woven nests, full of warriors and refugees, and the raw, stubborn labor of survival. The beach below still smoked where droids had come ashore. Gunships hovered over shallows churned white by impact, and Wookiee bowcasters thudded from bridge to bridge with the sound of giant hearts knocking against wood. Yoda stood near the command platform with his cane tucked under one arm and his ears turned toward a future that had not yet chosen its shape. The battle here had been brutal, but it possessed a simplicity war rarely allowed. Steel against steel, will against will, courage measured in visible things. He had spent too many years inside clouds of deception not to feel the honesty of that. Around him, giant allies moved with reverence even in haste. Their gratitude had a physical warmth to it, something he felt in the boards beneath his feet. Then the dark side struck its hidden bell. He did not feel the Jedi die all at once. That was what saved him from being overwhelmed. Instead, he felt the intention to kill them flare everywhere at once. A net pulled taut over the galaxy, and then he felt the net rip. Some lights went out. Some bent nearly to extinction and returned. Some were surrounded by familiar presences that transformed without warning into teeth. The pain of it bowed him forward. 2 clone commanders behind him received the order in the same second. Their helmets turned as one. Their hands moved toward their rifles. The command inside them was old, buried, waiting longer than many of their own memories. It surged upward with brutal certainty, and for one of them that certainty became action. For the other it became terror. Yoda heard the first man's finger tighten on the trigger. He also heard the second man whisper, "No," as if speaking to himself from the bottom of a well. He moved before either blaster fired. The first commander died with surprise still unfinished in his body. Yoda took him beneath the chin with a single upward stroke, pivoted under a spray of sparks, and struck the second across the wrist hard enough to send the rifle spinning into the leaves. The man collapsed to his knees, both hands clapped over his helmet, screaming with the voice of someone who wanted to obey and could no longer tell which part of himself was the mutiny. Wookiees roared. The nearest troopers raised their weapons in alarm, and then faltered as the cry rippled through their ranks. Half of them trained on Yoda. Half of them trained on the men beside them. One actually turned and fired into the air, as if to discharge the compulsion anywhere it could do no harm. The shot brought gunships swinging around in a dangerous arc above the beach. Pilots demanding target confirmation in sharp-clipped bursts that met a chaos of contradictory answers. Chewie reached Yoda first, bowcaster already up, eyes bright with fury and fear. Tarful came a pace behind, broad enough to turn a corridor into a wall, his growl so deep the planks underfoot seemed to answer it. Around them, Wookiee guards formed a living barrier, fur bristling, blades in hand, every massive frame bent toward defense. "Kill him," a trooper shouted, and it was impossible to know whether he meant Yoda or the clone writhing on the boards with blood at his nose and ears. "No one fires," another shouted back. No one fires until I know what this is. Blasters discharged anyway. Not many. Enough. A Wookiee on the far bridge took a bolt to the shoulder and tumbled against the rail. 2 clones went down almost at once, each hit by men wearing the same markings as their own. The battle lines on Kashyyyk, which had all day run cleanly toward the sea, folded inward and became a knot. Yoda felt the chip in the kneeling commander's skull like a splinter of forged intent, an object carrying another will. Not Sith exactly. Not living in itself. A device of biological obedience designed to bypass conscience and call it corruption. The dark side had not invented the command. It had only waited for the hour to speak it. Taken, your minds are, Yoda said softly, though few could hear him over the rising uproar. Not all. Enough. Chewie let out a sharp, questioning bark. Tarful leaned close, his voice a thick rumble of worry. Go. We must, Yoda said. Learn. We must. Broken, the trap is. Gone, the danger is not. Below them, a gunship pilot made his choice. Instead of strafing the platform, he rolled his craft hard and sent a warning barrage into open water, forcing the other gunship off its line. Someone in the second craft returned fire instinctively. One of the first craft's stabilizers blew, and the vehicle spun smoking toward the beach in a grinding crash that sent soldiers diving for cover. On the sand, clones and Wookiees who had spent the morning fighting together stared at one another through drifting smoke, unable to understand what had changed, except that everything had. Yoda closed his eyes for one grave second and reached again through the Force. Felucia answered in flashes of violet fear and fungal heat. A world of bridges answered with the metallic tang of catastrophe. There was fire on a city of endless towers. There was terror in a medical bay sealed by blast doors. There was a presence in pain falling through Corasont's lower winds and refusing to vanish. There was another, bright and fractured and terribly close to the dark, riding toward destiny with a heart that had not yet finished choosing its own name. More lived than Sidious had intended. More died than Yoda could bear. When he opened his eyes, the commander he had disarmed was looking up at him through tears. The man's pupils were blown wide. Blood shone at the edge of one nostril. General, he whispered, I don't know what's happening. Honesty was in him. So was violence. They were tearing him apart. Yoda lowered his blade. Chewie made a startled sound but did not interfere. Fight it, Yoda said. The clone's jaw locked so hard the muscles trembled. For a moment, Yoda thought the command might seize him again and drive him straight into murder. Instead, the man doubled over with a broken cry and clawed his own helmet away as if he could rip the order out through his scalp. Tarful barked an order of his own. Wookiee warriors moved swiftly, binding the trooper's hands but not killing him. Others disarmed every clone within reach, and to Yoda's muted astonishment, several of the men submitted with almost grateful desperation. The ones who did not were ugly to put down. They moved with the terrifying emptiness of puppets whose strings had been yanked by a god. But they were not all. Not nearly all. At the edge of the platform, the sea flashed with reflected fire. A transport on a distant branchway peeled away from the battle and angled toward the inland shadow, pilot ignoring every command chattering over military channels. Desertion. Mutiny. Survival. Yoda no longer bothered to distinguish the words too sharply. They were all children of the same broken hour. He looked once more toward the sky, where the Republic still flew its war colors over a world that no longer knew whether the Republic meant protection or execution. Corasont, he said. Chewie barked a question. Home. The strike came from. Home answers will be. The dark side was laughing somewhere in the center of the galaxy, confident even in imperfection. Sidious had failed to close his fist around the Jedi. That meant only that he would squeeze harder with what fingers still obeyed him. Yoda turned toward the hidden routes through the Tree City. Behind him, Kashyyyk convulsed with friendly fire and fraying allegiances. Ahead lay the capital, the temple, and whatever remained of the order that had trained itself for peace and forgotten to imagine a weapon buried inside trust. Above Mandalore, the Star Destroyer carried its own storm. The Venator moved through darkness with the confidence of a warship returning from victory. Engines steady, hull lights burning in geometric discipline along the length of the Great Wedge. Inside, men who had spent years becoming parts of a single machine began to discover where the machine ended and they began. Ahsoka felt the change before the klaxons started. She had spent long enough outside the Order to stop translating every disturbance into doctrine. But the Force still spoke to her in pressure and color. And what touched the ship then was a red so jagged it seemed to scrape the inside of her bones. She turned in the corridor just as Rex's hand flew to his helmet. He had only enough time to say her name. Not loudly. Not as warning. More like a plea made to one specific person in a universe suddenly full of enemies. Then he buckled. The command came through every channel. The carrier wave embedded in it was not merely heard. It was answered by what had been planted in the clones before any of them had drawn their first breath. Across the ship, troopers stopped in place as if struck through the spine. Some gasped. Some screamed. Some lifted blasters with horrifying calm. Others clawed at their own heads and demanded with absolute sincerity to know what was happening to them. Rex hit the deck on one knee. His fingers dug so hard into the metal that the gloved tips squealed. Ahsoka saw the war inside him with terrible clarity. It was not simply loyalty battling loyalty. It was self against invasion. Something alien had stepped into the seat of his will and was insisting it had always lived there. Blue helmets appeared at the far end of the corridor, rifles rising. "Stand down!" Ahsoka snapped, more out of habit than expectation. The men aimed at her. Then two of them aimed at Rex. Then one aimed at the man beside him. The unit had been painted in her colors as a gesture of honor, and now those same markings shook on armor plates that could not agree on who their enemy was. Rex looked up, face gray with pain beneath the open helmet, and forced out words one at a time. "Find Five's chip." Ahsoka understood enough. Horror brought the rest. The first shot came from a trooper whose hands had finally stopped trembling. She redirected it into the ceiling and was already moving when the corridor dissolved into noise. She did not kill. She could not. Not while the men attacking her wore the same features and many of the same expressions they had worn laughing in mess halls or listening awkwardly to her complaints about military stiffness. She cut blasters apart. She kicked rifles loose. She drove elbows into armored throats and used the Force to shove half a squad flat, without breaking bones if she could help it. But not all of them could be spared that easily. One clone, eyes blank with overwhelming compulsion, shot another through the chest for trying to lower his weapon. The dying man stared up in disbelief, as if his murderer had torn a hole in the laws of nature. Another threw himself bodily against a blast door control to seal off a compartment full of troopers still capable of choice before the command could claim them too. A third stood rigid with his rifle trained on Ahsoka and tears slipping soundlessly down his cheeks, finger refusing to move even while the chip inside him demanded it. The klaxons began then. Red lights strobed over white armor, blue paint, orange skin. The ship seemed to pulse around them like an inflamed organ. From deeper in the vessel came another sound, delighted laughter. Maul was still caged, but he did not need freedom to recognize opportunity. Through the ray shield of his confinement, he paced with the grace of a beast that knows the trap has been sprung on everyone except him. His eyes shone like coals banked under ash. Ahsoka dragged Rex behind a bulkhead as a volley scored sparks from the wall where his head had been. "Can you move?" He nodded once, then shook his head as if caught between two truths. "Chip," he said again, voice rawed. "Remove it. Before." His body seized. The command hit him in another wave, stronger now that the first shock had opened the path. He made a sound Ahsoka had never heard from him, not in battle, not under torture, not in grief. It was the sound of a man being forced to betray himself from the inside. She had known men ask for death more easily than he asked for help. "Find the chip," she told the droids. One droid extended a scanner. A bright point lit on the cranial image almost at once. No ordinary implant. No harmless enhancement. A control device nested where it could whisper to the whole nervous system. Ahsoka stared at it and felt the floor shift under everything she had thought she knew about the war. Outside, alarms rose another pitch. Someone had opened Maul's cell block. She knew without checking that it had been deliberate. A choice made by someone desperate enough to set one monster loose against another. The sound of distant panic took on a different texture as the former Sith Lord began carving his way through any orderly plan the ship had left. The droid prepared the extraction tools. "Do it," Ahsoka said. Rex seized her wrist with startling strength. His eyes were clear for one precious second. "Corasont," he said. "The old man? It's him." "I know." "No." He swallowed against another wave of agony. "Everyone has to know." Then the chip dragged him under again. The droids pinned his shoulders and began the procedure while Ahsoka took position at the door with both sabers lit. Troopers came in bursts. Some she stunned. Some never crossed the threshold because other clones, making their own impossible choices in the corridor, tackled them or diverted fire or jammed the doors long enough for the surgery to continue. One young trooper whose helmet bore her colors staggered in with a blaster wound already smoking across his chest, saluted her with rigid formality, and collapsed before he could say whatever message he had carried. The whole ship smelled of ozone, blood, and burning circuitry. Maul's laughter rolled once through the ventilation like a dark promise and vanished deeper into the vessel. When the droid finally lifted the chip free, Rex went still. Not peaceful. Exhausted beyond peace. Ahsoka looked at the tiny, slick object in the tool's grip and felt more fury than she had when whole armies had marched against her. Such a small thing to hold so much theft. Rex opened his eyes slowly. Confusion came first, then memory, then shame so immediate and violent she saw it before he spoke. "You fought it," she said. "I lost men anyway. You're alive. That matters right now." He stared at the chip. "No," he said hollowly. "That matters." The ship lurched. Somewhere not far away, something exploded with enough force to dim the lights. The Venator, vessel of the Republic, had become a battleground of its own crew, and outside its armor the galaxy was doing the same. Rex sat up too fast, ripping off sensors. "We get a message out," he said. "Temple, senators, anybody who'll listen." Ahsoka nodded once. Around them the medbay lights flickered red and white, as if the ship itself could not decide what color this hour belonged to. Night came early to Corasont when fear decided to wear the city's lights. Padme stood at the tall windows of her apartment with one hand braced against the transparent steel, and the other resting low against the life she carried. Below her, the capital burned in the ordinary way first. Traffic rivers, landing beacons, districts glowing according to wealth, function, custom. Then little by little, the pattern spoiled. Security craft cut across civilian lanes without warning. Senate police sirens multiplied. Military channels bled into public frequencies badly enough that, even from the residence tower, she could hear fragments from street speakers below. Emergency session, attack on the Chancellor. Stand clear of government routes. She had lived too long in the Republic's heart to mistake a narrative being built in real time. It always began with urgency. It always wore the voice of necessity. It always left out the first lie because once the first lie entered the air, the rest followed naturally. Anakin's absence sat in the apartment like another person. Not merely because he was gone, though that was felt in every room, but because something of him was still there, stretched thin and shaking across the bond they had never named in words she trusted. Fear radiated from him in waves so sharp they made her breath shallow. Triumph moved beneath it, for instance, and vanished. Shame burned hotter. It was the emotional weather of a man standing somewhere he could no longer recognize. 3PO hovered at a respectful distance, fussing pointlessly over channels and lights. He had the gift all anxious beings shared. The conviction that if enough surfaces were polished and enough buttons checked, catastrophe might be persuaded to take a later appointment. "Your Excellency," he said for the third time, "there is increasing concern in the Senate quarter. Several routes have been restricted and the building network is recommending shelter in place. Oh dear. That rarely precedes anything encouraging. Padme did not answer immediately. Her eyes were on a formation of lat gunships threading low between towers. Not toward the outer military districts, but toward the old temple district, where the great spires of the Jedi rose like a fossilized prayer from the city's center. There were too many ships for escort, too few for siege, and their formation was bad. One craft was nearly sideswiped by another and corrected at the last instant. Even from a distance, the movement looked wrong. Undisciplined. Confused. Her comm chimed on a private line. Bale's image rose from the holoprojector in blue light, already blurred by motion. He was in the back of a speeder, shoulders tense, robes open at the throat as if he had left the Senate in a hurry and not had the time to remember dignity. The city streamed behind him in streaks of white and gold. Padme, tell me you know what's happening. I know what the emergency channels are saying, he replied. The Chancellor is claiming the Jedi attempted a coup. Military units are moving on the temple. She looked once more at the gunships and at the civilian traffic scattering ahead of them like fish before a predator. If the Chancellor wanted the temple sealed, he would have sealed it by now. This looks like panic. Bale's expression tightened. I thought the same. I'm going there. Padme turned from the window. I'll meet you. No. He said it with real force, and for a moment she was grateful enough to be angry. The city had become a machine for stripping choice from people by calling it protection. Bale, you're too visible, and if this is what it looks like, then visibility is dangerous. Stay where you are. Reach anyone in the Senate who still has enough nerve to think. Find out whether Moss is calling a session or a coronation. I'll contact you from the causeway. The line hissed with interference. For 1 second his image doubled, as if the signal itself had been cut by a knife. When it cleared, the sounds behind him had changed. Not city hum. Shouting. Bale? Traffic lockout just hit the sector. He looked beyond her for a moment, listening to something from the front seat. And military priorities being overridden by something internal. The pilots don't know whether to obey Senate security or clone command. That should not be possible. It should not, Padme thought. And because it should not, she believed it. I'm going to the temple, Bale said. If this is a lie, it's a big one. Lies that size never travel alone. The transmission cut. Padme stood still long enough for dread to become action. Then she crossed the room in a quick straight line and began gathering what she would need. Senatorial credentials, emergency code cylinders, a cloak dark enough to pass unremarked in a crowd, the compact blaster she hated keeping and hated more to need. 3PO made a horrified little sound. You are not remaining here, she said without looking at him. Oh dear. At the temple, the old peace had already gone. The great entrance halls, designed for petitioners and students and diplomats and pilgrims, filled instead with the flat metallic note of lockdown. Bronze doors sealed in stages. Shield generators rose from hidden housings. Service droids skittered at impossible speed under the guidance of beings who had spent their lives mastering serenity and now discovered how loud urgency could be when it echoed under sacred ceilings. No one announced a war. They announced procedures. That was more frightening. Initiates were being moved. Archives were being sealed. The halls hummed with fragments of distress transmissions from worlds, the temple maps marked in patient green. Some channels ended in static. Some ended in screams. Some ended in silence so complete it seemed to accuse the living of cowardice. And outside on the temple causeway, the first of the gunships set down in confusion rather than triumph. Bale's speeder reached the outer perimeter just as 2 platoons of clone troopers began arguing at blaster point over whether the doors in front of them were targets or protected property. The commander at the front had his helmet on and his hands steady. The lieutenant beside him had ripped his own off and looked like a man trying to remember his children's names. Temple security, not yet willing to fire on the army they had fought beside for years, held the stairs with pikes and restraint. "Stand down," Bale called as he stepped out into air smelling of exhaust and rain. Several rifles swung toward him. Several dropped at once. Recognition moved through the front rank like a shiver. Senators still had the strange power of making soldiers remember that governments contain people, not just commands. "This district is under emergency military authority," the commander said. "By whose order?" "The Chancellor's." "Then show me the authorization." The commander hesitated. Not because he did not have it. Because in that exact instant, a gunship overhead clipped the edge of a temple spire while trying to adjust formation, showering sparks down the stone, and 3 troopers on the left flank threw themselves flat, as if expecting attack from their own aircraft. The commander looked up involuntarily. So did everyone else. The break in attention was tiny and absolute. The confidence of an operation carried by total obedience had been replaced by the brittle danger of men watching each other. Bale saw it and knew the lie had slipped somewhere. A shot cracked from the rear. No one ever agreed later who fired first. On the causeway itself, it scarcely mattered. The bolt struck a temple guard in the shoulder. Half the troopers flinched toward the impact. The other half wheeled toward the clone who had fired, because he had done so without order, and with an expression so empty it chilled even his brothers. Then the night opened. Temple guards raised shields. Troopers shouted over one another. A second shot came from the stairs, then a third from the troop line, and suddenly the Temple of the Jedi, which had stood for 1,000 generations at the center of the Republic, was lit by weapons the Republic had built. Bale hit the deck behind a low transport barrier and tasted stone dust. Overhead, searchlights cut through the rising smoke. Civilians on surrounding promenades began to scream and scatter. Somewhere behind the sealed doors, bells started tolling in slow, measured peals that sounded like judgment. He looked up through the confusion and saw the temple's highest beacon turn from open white to war red. On the far side of the city, Padme's speeder left the secured lane with R2 clamped to the rear bracket, and 3PO muttering himself nearly into shutdown in the passenger alcove. She kept low, using senators' access routes wherever they still existed and ordinary traffic where they did not. Every public screen she passed was beginning to fill with the Chancellor's crest. The speech had not aired yet. That meant he was still writing it. In the Chancellor's office, the dark side smelled of burnt flesh and old victory. Anakin stood where Mace had fallen and could not stop seeing the shape of absence in the air. The room bore the marks of violence with an almost ceremonial precision. A window wall had burst outward, leaving the city's lights exposed beyond a jagged frame. Furniture had been flung against columns. The floor was blackened where lightning had crawled over it in branching veins. Sidious sat in the high curve of the office chair like a thing half created in fire, his skin drawn tight and ruined. His smile made smaller and therefore somehow more terrible. Whatever mask he had worn as Chancellor was gone now. The face beneath it looked like the truth of every secret corridor in the Senate made flesh. Mas stood nearby with his grave bureaucrat's composure stretched nearly transparent. Sly watched from a little farther back, eyes hooded, pale face unreadable in the dim light. Both had already adjusted. That, more than the wounds, chilled Anakin. The galaxy split open, and these two had simply stepped onto the next stone. The order had gone out seconds earlier. It should have been done by now. Not finished, perhaps, but begun with unmistakable certainty. Sidious had promised him precision. The Jedi would fall in a single coordinated stroke, too fast to regroup, too complete to resist. The Republic would be saved from treachery before it even understood how close the danger had come. Power would follow. Knowledge would follow. Padme would live because he would no longer be a powerless witness to the one future that mattered. Instead, the room was filling with uncertainty. Reports arrived in pulses across the tactical display, and none of them matched. Confirmed kills, lost signals, unacknowledged orders, clone units engaging unauthorized friendlies, commanders requesting clarification through private channels that should never have existed at such a moment. A holo from a sector group blinked on and off so fast the words became only fragments. Jedi targets survived. Unit compliance compromised, medical emergency among personnel. Repeat. Sidious's fingers tightened on the arm of the chair. Anakin saw it and felt a coldness he did not want to name. Fear. Not much. Not enough to rule him. But there. The Dark Lord had thrown his blade, and the blade had struck bone. Their corruption runs deeper than anticipated, Sidious said, as though the display proved exactly what he had predicted. The Jedi have infected the very forces sworn to protect the Republic. No matter. Imperfect servants only sharpen the hand of the Master. The words were calm. The air around him was not. Anakin felt rage moving under the surface, looking for a throat to close around. Maz inclined his head. A Senate address is prepared. We can declare a full emergency transfer of power within the hour. Within the half hour, Sidious said. The longer confusion lingers, the more room there is for doubt. Sly stepped forward one pace, elegant even in near darkness. Doubt already exists in the military channels. Several commanders are requesting direct voice verification. Then give it to them, Sidious snapped. The order stands. It will be obeyed. Anakin stared at the tactical feed and saw flashes of places he knew. Temple District, Corasont. A command channel from the 501st requesting updated rules of engagement because resistance was expected from clones as well as Jedi. A ship identifier that might have been the transport carrying the former Darth Maul. A Kashyyyk report too broken to parse. A line from Utapau reading target status unconfirmed. Unconfirmed. Obi-Wan should have been dead. Yoda should have been dead. The temple should already have been broken open by the men he had fought beside for years. Instead, the whole pattern stuttered like a bad dream. Sidious watched him watching. You feel their confusion, he said softly. Good. Let it teach you the weakness of divided loyalties. Anakin's throat tightened. Divided loyalties. There was a bitter cleanliness to hearing the phrase spoken aloud by the man who had spent years carving them into him. The temple remains, Sidious continued. Then you will do what the clones cannot. Anakin looked at him. You know every corridor, every discipline, every hiding place. The surviving Jedi will run there. The initiates will be used as shields. Sentiment will preserve them unless you act. The ruined face leaned forward, hungry and paternal all at once. End it. End the old order tonight, and the path to saving Padme opens before us without obstruction. Padme. He could still feel her in the distance. Not words, never words, but the ache of her concern touching the edge of him. He thought of her hands. He thought of the children he might one day give her if he succeeded. He thought of the visions that had driven him, the absolute helplessness of watching someone die, because the Force showed you the future and refused you the power to change it. He also thought, with unwanted vividness, of the temple crèches and quiet training rooms, of boys younger than he had been when the Jedi took him in, of girls who still held sabers too large for their hands and believed adulthood wore patience as naturally as robes. Sidious saw that thought cross him as surely as if he had spoken it. The young learn quickly, the Sith said. They will grow into enemies you are too wise to leave behind. Anakin hated that the logic struck cleanly even while something in him recoiled. Outside the shattered office window, Coruscant's endless lights flared under emergency traffic grids. Sirens moved in ribbons. Somewhere in that city Padme was waiting, perhaps already frightened by the stories flooding public channels. Somewhere in that same city the temple still stood, and if it still stood, then Mace's death had not bought the certainty Anakin had told himself it had to buy. Maz cleared his throat with careful deference. The 501st is on approach and awaiting your command. Not Sidious's. Yours. A deliberate gift. A deliberate chain. Anakin felt the trap in it and stepped into it anyway, because he no longer knew how to step anywhere else. He knelt. The floor was still warm from lightning. He bowed his head, and though he knew kneeling was theater, he also knew theater had power. Men became what they performed often enough, especially under the eyes of someone who knew how to reward the performance and punish the pause before it. I understand, he said. A lie because he did not understand anything except fear and momentum. A truth. because he knew exactly what the order meant. Sidious rose from the chair with emotion too fluid for his years and injuries, robe whispering over the blackened floor. He came close enough that Anakin could smell the ozone still clinging to him. One ruined hand touched the crown of Anakin's head, in a gesture that might once have passed for blessing. "My apprentice," he murmured, "do not fail me in what destiny has placed in your hands." The touch made Anakin's skin crawl. He stood and turned before the revulsion could show. The lift down to the private landing platform felt longer than any descent he had ever taken. 501st troopers waited in disciplined ranks beneath the office tower, helmets on, weapons checked, gunship engines idling hot. These were his men. Men who had marched with him through open slaughter and followed him into objectives no sane tactician would have called survivable. Their loyalty had always been the cleanest thing in war. Now he could feel rot under it. One trooper near the front stood too stiffly. Another flexed his left hand over and over as if it no longer belonged in the glove. Apo stepped forward for orders, voice hard and professional. But even he blinked too much. Jaw clenched so tight the muscles jumped under the skin. "The temple," Anakin said. No one questioned it. Not allowed. They boarded. Gunships lifted. As the formation banked through the government district, public screens all across Corasont flickered to life with Sidious crest and voice. Emergency powers. Jedi betrayal. An attempt on the life of the Chancellor. The words rolled over the city with the smooth authority of pre-written history. Anakin listened and heard how carefully each sentence had been built to close doors in the mind. Then a channel cut through military frequency. Brief, garbled, unauthorized. "Find the chip." Rex's voice. Anakin froze. It vanished under static before anyone else could react. Perhaps no one had understood it. Perhaps everyone had. Apo glanced sideways from the opposite bench, something like pain crossing the narrow strip of skin visible below his visor. "What was that, sir?" Anakin looked at the men around him. Brothers bred in vats, trained in steel, asked to die before they were old enough to know what old meant. He had led them because he admired their courage. He had never truly asked what had made such obedience possible. "Interference," he said. Another lie. Another step. Below, the temple district glowed red. Inside the temple, the guardians of memory discovered that memory could draw blood. Sin moved through the halls with a stripped-down calm that left no room for wasted fear. He had spent years teaching precision as a way of life, not merely of combat. Feet set here. Wrist angle there. Breathe through the strike. Think through the chaos. The younger students sometimes mistook him for severe until they discovered, under that severity, the deep patience of a man who believed discipline was kindness when the world turned ugly. The world had turned uglier than even he had planned for. He passed from corridor to corridor with temple guards at his shoulders and assignments coming cleanly from his mouth. Close the hall of initiates. Move the youngest to the lower sanctuaries. Arm only those Padawans already capable of defense. The rest receive escorts. Seal the archives but preserve master access. No one enters through the main stairs without identity confirmation from 3 separate sources. Anyone arriving alone is searched no matter what rank they claim, especially if they claim rank. In the library, Jocasta stood amid towers of old knowledge with a holocron balanced in both hands like a heart removed from a body. The old woman's face, lined by years and by impatience with anyone who believed the universe began on the day they were born, had gone flint hard. "They will not touch this collection," she said without preamble when Sin entered. "They may try. Then they will fail here before they fail elsewhere." Droids rolled between shelves carrying locked cases to deeper vaults. Blue and green cubes vanished into shielded recesses older than the Republic's current constitution. Jocasta supervised each movement personally, and from time to time she paused to touch a shelf or console, as if memorizing the room against fire. A young initiate stood near the central table, small hands clenched in his robe. "Master," he asked, not even trying to hide the tremor in his voice, "are the clones attacking us?" No teacher in that room had ever prepared a lesson for how to answer that cleanly. Jocasta turned before Sin could. Her expression softened a fraction. "Some are," she said. "Some are fighting something inside themselves. Fear makes cowards of many beings. It also makes heroes in ways no one expects." The boy nodded because children will nod to almost anything if an adult says it firmly enough. He did not understand. None of them did, not fully. But they could hear the fighting outside now, faint through the mass of the temple walls. Every burst of blaster fire made shoulders jerk. In the communications chamber, the situation was worse than any battlefield map could show. Distress calls came layered 3 and 4 deep, each trying to claim priority by the intensity of suffering behind it. Some Jedi reached the temple only long enough to speak a world's name before transmission died. Others managed coherent warnings, clones turning, commanders compromised, trust nothing carried on Republic channels. One voice, shocked, clipped, grimly familiar, made half the room still. Obi-Wan Kenobi. The message was thin and crackling, clearly sent under pressure from a stolen or damaged link. "All Jedi units, this is Obi-Wan. The clone army has been compromised by some hidden command. Do not trust the Chancellor. Repeat, do not trust the Chancellor. Temple, if you receive this, seal the lower levels and broadcast a full warning to every surviving enclave. Some clones are resisting. Separate them if you can. Do not assume uniform compliance." Aye. The channel failed, returned for half a word, and died. Sin listened without expression. Then he repeated the essential points once, clearly, to the operators around him, and watched them become system-wide instructions. Outside the main gates, the conflict had hardened into something uglier than battle, because battle assumes sides. Here the sides kept breaking and reforming in men who wore identical faces and armor. Temple guards held the stairs under shield domes. Troopers took cover behind gunship struts and ornamental barriers, exchanging fire in short bursts, not only with the guards but with their own brothers when compulsion and resistance collided. One squad dropped weapons entirely and knelt with hands laced behind their heads, begging someone, anyone, to stun them before they hurt somebody. Another charged the stairs in perfect drill formation, eyes flat, and had to be driven back by concentrated non-lethal fire that became lethal only when a chip-ridden sergeant detonated a thermal charge at his own feet to breach the shield line. Bale, trapped behind low cover near the temple rail, watched all of it with a statesman's useless clarity. He could see the pattern and not stop it. The clones were not executing a clean purge. They were tearing themselves open trying to do it. That fact might save the order. It might also drown the city in a civil war no one had planned for because no one but the architect had ever known the blueprint. A temple guard reached him during a lull and pulled him through a service access while the outer stairs still held. By the time he made it inside, robes streaked with dust and smoke, the bells were still sounding. Sin met him near the Hall of Knighthood. "Senator, tell me you know what is happening." "We know enough." The Chancellor moved first. "The army is compromised." "Nah. Compromised by what?" "We are still discovering the mechanism." Bale looked past him as a line of children was hurried down a side corridor by older students trying very hard to imitate serenity and not quite succeeding. "You're evacuating the youngest. To lower sanctuaries, off-world routes are no longer secure." Bale swallowed. "Padme is on her way." Sin's eyes sharpened. "Why?" "Because she is Padme." That was explanation enough. A burst of static crackled from a nearby comm station. Then a new transmission cut through, stronger than Obi-Wan's and astonishing in its source. Ahsoka's voice, strained but level, identified a chip in the clone's brains as the likely trigger. Rex came on immediately after, confirming as much between gritted breaths. They had removed one. Others could be removed. The procedure details followed in clipped medical jargon stolen from a droid feed and rebroadcast to any frequency willing to carry it. The room changed around that message. Until then, the clones had been enemy, ally, casualty, or question mark according to the angle of the next blaster bolt. Now there was a material cause, a point of attack, a theft with shape and method. It did not restore trust. Nothing could do that quickly. But it made the nightmare concrete. Jocasta arrived from the library in time to hear the end of the transmission. Her old face tightened with a fury so pure it looked young. "Camino," she said. "Perhaps," Sin replied. "No, perhaps. Those bland, smiling cloners gave us an army and buried a knife inside it." The floor trembled. A heavy impact struck the outer gate. Another. Then, engines. Anakin's gunship formation had arrived. Even before anyone announced it, the temple felt him. His presence entered the building like a storm front remembered from childhood. Familiar, immense, exhilarating, dangerous. Some of the younglings brightened at once because heroes had names and his was one of the brightest. Some of the older Jedi went still with an unease they could not yet justify. Bail looked toward the sealed entrance and felt his heart sink for reasons he could not have explained if asked. "Master Skywalker is here," one Padawan said from the far end of the hall, and relief rose in his voice as naturally as breath. Sin did not share it. He met Bail's eyes across the chamber and said very quietly, "Find the senator from Naboo the moment she arrives. Keep her away from the front stairs." Outside, the first of the temple's great bronze doors shuddered under a coded override request from a man the building had never once considered a threat. Utapau did not care what governments called treason. Its caverns had held older crimes than politics, older loyalties than republics. Water dripped from impossible heights. The stone breathed cold. Somewhere far above, men argued themselves toward one future or another, while Obi-Wan climbed through darkness with wet robes dragging at his limbs and the weight of a galaxy settling into sharper shape around him. Boga did not rise again. He found the Varactyl on a shelf of rock where the current had taken her, one side broken, eyes already losing the living brightness that had made her look perpetually on the verge of indignation. Obi-Wan crouched beside her in the dim and laid a hand against the striped hide until the last warmth fled. Grief could not have more than a second in such an hour, but he gave her that second because he had long ago decided that denying grief was not the same as mastering it. Then he climbed. The sinkhole walls offered ledges only to beings desperate enough to see them. Twice he nearly slipped. Once he had to hang by one hand over black water while loose stone rattled past his boots into the dark below. Above him came the intermittent crack of blaster fire and, more tellingly, the unevenness of it. A steady execution required discipline. This sounded like panic, skirmish, argument. By the time he reached a maintenance aperture near the upper terraces, night had edged over Utapau. Emergency lights washed the tunnels in red. Smoke drifted through the shafts where fighting had moved from droids to men. Obi-Wan slipped into a service corridor and found the first body at once. A clone trooper sprawled against the wall, dead from a shot that had entered beneath the chin at too close a range to have come from a Jedi in flight. Friendly fire, or resistance punished. The distinction blurred in practice. Further on he heard voices. Orders are orders. Then you obey them. I'm done shooting at my own men because a voice on the line says so. No. The Jedi are traitors. General Obi-Wan saved your life on Ba's pity. That doesn't matter. Then why are you shaking? Obi-Wan stopped in the shadow of a broken bulkhead and looked through. Cody stood in the center of the corridor without helmet or blaster raised, surrounded by troopers with weapons in varying states of readiness. His face had gone gray with exhaustion. Blood marked one ear, and the strain around his eyes made him look older than the war alone could account for. Two soldiers on the right had their rifles trained toward the lower passages, where search teams should have been. Three others had turned their muzzles toward the men on the right. No one trusted anyone's next movement. One of the younger troopers saw Obi-Wan first. His eyes went wide. His rifle came halfway up and froze there as if the arm obeyed a different man than the face. Every head turned. For one suspended heartbeat, no one moved. Then Cody said, very flatly, "Stand down." The order hit the corridor like a dropped blade. Some obeyed. Some tightened their grips. Obi-Wan kept his own hands visible, though the lightsaber on his belt had never felt heavier. "Commander," he said. It was not accusation. That would have been easier to bear. Cody's mouth twitched once. General. The word sounded injured. One of the troopers on the right snarled and fired. The bolt came wild, clipping the wall near Obi-Wan's shoulder because another clone knocked the barrel aside at the last second. The corridor exploded. Men shouted. A stun blast took the would-be shooter in the chest before Obi-Wan even moved. Another trooper lunged for Cody's sidearm, screaming that the order had not been carried out. Cody drove an elbow into his throat, turned the weapon free, and put him down with a non-lethal shot that carried all the force of personal disgust. Obi-Wan ignited his saber only long enough to catch 2 bolts aimed by reflex and send them into the ceiling. Dust rained down. Lights flickered. Enough! Cody roared. This time, perhaps because everyone had reached the limit of what terror could sustain, the command held. The corridor filled with hard breathing and the smell of scorched stone. Obi-Wan deactivated his blade. You tried to kill me. Cody shut his eyes briefly. Yes. No excuse. No denial. Just the ugly fact between them. Why? Cody laughed once, without humor. I'd very much like to know. He touched the side of his head as if he expected to find the answer under the skin. The Chancellor gave an order. Something in us answered before thought did. Some of the men snapped to it like they'd been waiting their whole lives. Some didn't, or not all the way. It was like being buried under your own body while it kept moving. Now, Obi-Wan listened and felt no deception in him, only shame and pain. A chip, Obi-Wan said. We've had a warning from another source, some kind of control device. Cody's expression changed with sickening speed from confusion to realization to fury. In our heads. In all likelihood. The silence that followed had the quality of sacrilege. One of the troopers lowered his rifle completely. You're telling me they built us like this? I'm telling you someone did. Cody looked at the men around him, at the dead clone in the corridor bend, at the blaster in his own hand. How many worlds? Too many. The commander swallowed. He was doing arithmetic. No officer should ever have to do. Every Jedi general paired with a clone battalion. Every battlefield turning inward. Every friendship mined years in advance. The temple? Under attack. The words landed like a physical blow. Cody straightened. The chip had not released him entirely. Obi-Wan could feel its pressure still, a buried rage clawing upward whenever the Jedi stood too near. But now another force opposed it openly. His own will, battered and furious. I can't promise every man here is free of it, Cody said. I can promise not all of them are lost. That was more than Obi-Wan had expected to receive. I need a ship. Cody almost smiled, which only made him look more tired. General, in this army, if I don't know where every ship is, I'm already dead. He gave quick orders. A small escort peeled off to secure the landing shelf where Grievous Starfighter had been impounded. One trooper objected. Cody stunned him before the protest became a shot. No one moved to avenge it. At the platform, wind struck them full in the face. The sinkhole below had gone black. Searchlights swept the walls, no longer looking for Obi-Wan but for deserters and snipers in the next betrayal. Grievous's ugly craft crouched where it had landed, all predatory angles and insect arrogance. Obi-Wan spared it a look of professional distaste and climbed into the cockpit. Cody stood below the open canopy. I should report target eliminated, he said. The old soldier's instinct in him admired the elegance immediately. Will that buy time? Not much. Maybe enough. Obi-Wan held his gaze. Cody, boy. Again that involuntary flinch at the use of his name. Sir, I'm sorry. The commander stared as if the apology were the one thing in the galaxy he had not trained for. General, I shot you off a cliff. Yes, and I suspect you did not enjoy it. Mesdames. Something twisted in Cody's face then. Something so close to grief Obi-Wan looked away to spare him the humiliation of being seen too clearly. Go, Cody said, before I lose the argument in my own skull. Obi-Wan sealed the canopy and lifted. As the fighter clawed into the night, he transmitted everything he had on every frequency he could touch. Temple channels, Senate emergency bands, old field networks, anyone and anything still capable of hearing. Clone army compromised. Control chips. Do not trust the Chancellor. Separate willing troopers from compelled ones where possible. Survive first. Ask questions later. Below him, Utapau shrank into rings of light around old stone holes. On one platform, Cody stood with half a battalion at his back, a commander in the middle of a mutiny that was also a liberation and also a crime, and watched the starfighter vanish toward Corasont. By the time Padme reached the Temple district, the city had learned to fear its own uniforms. R2 rode the rear bracket of her speeder with indignant determination, dome turning in sharp, nervous ticks as he sliced traffic grids on the move and rerouted them a fraction faster than the public systems could revoke her access. 3PO had long since abandoned the pretense of composure. "This is not a safe district," he said for perhaps the 20th time. "I cannot stress that enough. There is active weapons fire, several contradictory security orders, and I believe one of the public announcements just called for citizens to report suspicious monastic behavior, which seems dreadfully broad." "Nande, Andi, Ki, Kado, Koral." Padme barely heard him. Her attention had narrowed to the red line of the temple beacon ahead, and to the presence she could feel near it now with awful clarity. Anakin. Not inside yet. At the threshold of something, balanced on the edge of a decision that might define the rest of every life tied to his. The outer causeways were a mess of abandoned speeders, scattered pedestrians, and military cordons no one seemed fully able to enforce. Senate police argued with clone officers over jurisdiction, while blaster fire from the upper stairs made the argument almost academic. Padme cut through a maintenance ramp, grounded the speeder behind a shattered decorative wall, and ran toward the side approach with Bale's last coordinates burning on her comm. At the main stairs, Anakin had landed. The 501st deployed with practice speed, but practice could not erase doubt. Apo barked formation orders and most of the men obeyed. Some obeyed too perfectly, moving with that dead smoothness Anakin was beginning to recognize as the chip overruling the person inside. Others lagged half a step, enough to earn suspicious looks from their brothers. One trooper removed his helmet as if desperate for air and immediately took a blow from the butt of another rifle for breaking discipline. A third swung his weapon not toward the temple but toward the trooper who struck him. The bronze doors of the entrance hall towered above them, marked by override glyphs beginning to pulse under Anakin's authorization code. Inside, he could feel dozens of minds bright with fear, training, grief, and hope. Some of that hope was for him. The thought landed like a blade under the ribs. Apo came to his side. "Orders, General." The title cut deeper than the future name Sidious had tried to give him. Before he could answer, the doors opened a handspan, and a voice projected from within. Bale, amplified by temple acoustics and political outrage. "Anakin, if you can hear me, the Chancellor has attacked the Order under false pretenses. The clones have been compromised. Stand your men down." No one on the stairs breathed. Apo's helmet turned slightly toward Anakin. So did every other helmet in hearing range. 100 lives balanced on whether he would accept public contradiction from a senator in the middle of a military action. The chip-ridden sergeant nearest the front made the choice first. He fired at the opening. Temple shields snapped up just in time. The bolts scattered golden across the barrier. Half the 501st fired with him. Half did not. Anakin's world became motion. He wrenched the sergeant's rifle aside with the force before the second shot could hit, and dragged the man bodily backward across the stone. Apo shouted for restraint. Another clone, deeper under compulsion, shot Apo in the pauldron. 2 men tackled that shooter before Anakin could turn. Someone screamed for medics. Someone else yelled that the Jedi were using mind tricks. A temple guard thrust a pike through the gap in the doors and hooked one trooper's blaster out of his hands without drawing blood, which enraged 3 more men and heartened 2. The battle did not begin. It resumed, already inside everyone. Anakin ignited his lightsaber. The blue blade cast harsh light over helmets, smoke, bronze, fear. Every eye fixed on him. The men under the chip saw a weapon they expected to lead them through slaughter. The men fighting it saw a chance, maybe the last one, for someone they trusted to stop the nightmare. He stood in that attention and discovered that nothing in his life had prepared him for the weight of being believed by the wrong people. "Hold," he said. The chip-ridden heard hold as tactical delay. The resisting heard it as mercy. Neither interpretation was entirely wrong. Another unauthorized transmission cut across local comms. Rex's voice again, stronger this time, backed by medical data and Ahsoka's urgent confirmation. Chip locations. Surgical procedures. Proof. The message bled through helmet speakers all along the stair. A clone on the left ripped off his helmet and staggered, whispering, "It's true." The sergeant, still trapped in Anakin's invisible grip, snarled like an animal. "Jedi lie." Anakin looked at him and felt only pity edged with terror. Not because the man was monstrous, but because he wasn't. Because the monster had been fitted into him and called loyalty. The temple doors opened another handspan. Inside, the gap Bail stood beside a line of guards, robes dusty, face lit by shield glare. Beyond him, Anakin glimpsed deeper halls and shadows moving fast. Children being moved, wounded carried, swords already drawn where there should have been only peace. For a flashing second he saw not the temple as target but as home. The first place that had given structure to his chaos. The first place that had ever expected more from him than survival. Its failures were real. Its blindness had cost him and others dearly. But it had not deserved extermination at the hands of the army it commanded. He deactivated his blade. The act stunned everyone. Utapau, clutching his scorched shoulder, looked at him as if the gesture itself required translation. "We don't breach," Anakin said. The chip-ridden sergeant bellowed denial. Two troopers raised rifles toward the doors anyway. Anakin moved faster than thought and sent both weapons spinning into the air where temple guards could not misread the intention. More men shifted, some to fire, some to lower their own guns in exhausted relief. Then public screens all across the district flared to life with Sidious speech, voice amplified over the city. The Chancellor, newly maimed and cloaked in outrage, declared the Jedi traitors to the Republic. He named their so-called coup. He invoked emergency reorganization of state power. He praised the clone army for its sacrifice in defense of civilization. The words washed over the stairs just as everyone there watched clones shoot clones, and a Jedi general refused to storm his own temple. No speech could wholly survive that contradiction. Padme reached the lower side entrance in time to hear the declaration echoing off stone. Bail's security tag got her through the first maintenance shield. Temple aides caught sight of her and ushered her forward through a service hall smelling of hot metal and incense. She heard children crying somewhere nearby, quickly hushed. She heard blasters outside. She felt Anakin so close she had to grip the wall. When she stepped into the antechamber leading toward the main stair, Bail turned in astonishment and anger that lasted only an instant before relief displaced it. "I told you to stay away, and you know by now how useful that is as advice." He wanted to argue. The city did not permit it. "He's outside," he said. "I know." Bail looked at her very carefully then, politician yielding ground to friend. "Can you reach him?" Padme's eyes went to the shielded doorway and the blue glow fading beyond it. "I don't know." Outside, Anakin stared up at the bronze doors and felt Sidious' voice still rolling over the district, weaving history at speed. He could step through those doors and make the lie true. He could refuse and become, in the eyes of the new power rising over Corasont, the next traitor to be removed. For the first time since kneeling in the ruined office, he understood that the choice was not between action and inaction. It was between whose lie would own him. The city did not often give back what it had swallowed. Far below the polished towers and Senate domes, where Coruscant became machinery and shadow, and 1,000 forgotten economies stacked one over another, Mace woke to pain sharp enough to make the rest of existence seem hypothetical. He had hit a service awning, broken through it, struck a transit canopy, and finally come to rest in a cargo cradle 3 levels below the first respectable district. Survival had not been elegant. Survival seldom was. His right hand was gone. One side of his body burned with lightning memory so severe that every breath arrived late. Blood had dried stiff in his robes. The world came back in fragments. Sidious face distending under his own power. Anakin's blades severing the chance of clean justice. The window giving way, the long impossible drop, and below it all, a certainty he had hated even as he held it. This was not over. He had expected to wake dead. Instead, he woke in a hidden clinic carved behind a repair market, with a med droid humming over improvised sealant, and a woman in grease-stained work coveralls watching him as if he might detonate. "You moved," she said. Mace tested the statement. The room tilted. "How long? An hour? Maybe a little more. Hard to say." The city started screaming and the clock stopped mattering. Her accent placed her somewhere deep in the industrial levels, a life spent under systems too grand to notice her unless they needed labor. Two other beings occupied the clinic, an old Bith medic with lenses magnifying his eyes to frighten moons, and a clone trooper sitting against the far wall with his helmet off, and a stun cuff locked around one wrist. The clone looked up and Mace saw the same struggle he had already seen in visions flashing across the Force. Not wholly enemy, not safely ally. "You found me," Mace said. The woman gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "You fell through my roof." That, somehow, seemed fair. A public screen mounted near the clinic door flickered with Sidious' address. The sound was low, but the meaning carried. Jedi treason. Emergency, reorganization, protection of the state. Mace pushed himself upright on the cot, every muscle protesting. "The temple," he said. The clone in the corner straightened instinctively. "Still standing last I heard." Mace turned toward him. The trooper swallowed. "Channels are a mess. Some units are following the order. Some aren't. They say there's something in our heads. A chip." He looked down at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "I almost shot a kid in a corridor because a voice told me to." Mace read no deception, only horror. The Bith medic moved to stop him as he rose. Mace ignored the attempt. Pain washed through him in hard white sheets, but pain he knew how to carry. What mattered was the Force. The temple still burned in it, not as ruin but as contested ground. Yoda lived. Obi-Wan lived. Anakin blazed at the heart of the capital like a star entering collapse, drawn between gravity wells that would tear any ordinary man apart. "Master Jedi," the woman said sharply, "if you stand up again without help, you're going to die in my clinic after I just used half a month's supplies on you." Mace looked at her. Ordinary citizen, unasked witness to a coup. She should have left him for the patrols, and instead she had hidden him under a false tarp and called a medic who owed her money. The Republic had been built on people like her while spending most of its time pretending only senators mattered. "Then I'll try to take fewer dramatic falls," he said. It was a poor joke. To her credit, she snorted anyway. The clone struggled against his cuff. "Take me with you." "Why?" "Because I know the access routes they'll use to cut the temple from the transit grid. Because if the chip hits me again, I want someone with a lightsaber nearby. And because I owe the Order more than one good choice before this night ends." Mace studied him for half a breath. Then he nodded. The woman cursed softly. "This is the worst patient turnover I've ever seen." She threw him a dark cloak scavenged from some market stall. He took it with his left hand, awkward and furious with the awkwardness, and wrapped it over the scorched remains of his robe. The Bith injected him with something that turned the edges of pain from knives into hammers. Not comfort. Function. By the time they reached the mid-level transit web, the speech above had become law in districts too frightened to contest it. Military patrols were forming cordons. Civilians clustered around public screens, faces upturned in that expression democratic societies wear when trying to decide whether to believe the announcement or their own eyes. On one bridge, Mace passed a vendor standing in front of a shattered stall, insisting to anyone who would listen that she had just seen clone troopers rescue a Jedi Padawan from other clone troopers. No one could fit that into the speech they had heard, so most pretended not to hear her at all. The temple's beacon glowed red through the layered city haze. The clone guiding him, young, scar at the chin, fear worn openly now that the helmet was gone, kept them to maintenance routes, service lifts, scaffolds clinging to the undersides of traffic arteries. Several times patrols passed close enough that Mace could smell the heat from their armor plating. Once they found a group of civilians sheltering in a transit alcove around a holoprojector, carrying Bale's emergency statement countering the Chancellor's claims. The signal was weak, but the Senator's voice was unmistakable. He named the attack as unlawful. He cited conflicting evidence from military channels. He demanded independent inquiry and full medical investigation of the clones. A challenge. Not enough by itself. Never enough by itself. But challenges were how walls began to crack. Mace listened for one thing only: Anakin. The bond between them had never been gentle. It had always been a line pulled too taut between incompatible understandings of power, duty, fear. Yet it existed, and in the Force that night it blazed with terrible complexity. Anakin had not gone fully into darkness. Not yet. If he had, the temple would already feel different. Quieter. More final. A crossroads, Mace thought, limping through the underlevels with borrowed painkillers in his blood, and a traitorous city above. The boy stands at a crossroads and the galaxy is balanced under his heel. The clone touched his arm and pointed. Through a gap between towers, high and impossibly distant, the temple steps flashed with blue light. A lightsaber. Anakin's. Not striking. Held. Me. Mace exhaled once, slow and dangerous. "Can you get me to a side entrance?" he asked. The clone nodded. "Service lift on the west face. Temple maintenance crews use it. Security knows it. But most military units won't." "Then we go there." They moved. Across the city, Padme stood just inside the temple's lower shield line and looked toward the main stair while Bale argued with surviving senators over emergency channels. She could feel Anakin stalled on the threshold. It would not last. No man could hold that much pressure indefinitely without breaking one way or the other. She took one step toward the stair. Bale caught her wrist. "If you go out there now and the wrong trooper sees you, you become leverage. If I stay in here and he chooses alone, the whole galaxy becomes leverage." He did not release her at once. Then, slowly he did. Outside, Apo had finally gotten a medic patch sealed over his shoulder and was trying to reorganize men who no longer fit into clean categories. Those fully under the chip kept glancing toward Anakin with murderous impatience. Those resisting watched him with a pleading he would have found unbearable if he had allowed himself to meet their eyes for long. On the public screens, Sidious finished naming the Republic reborn under a harder order. The word Empire did not appear, not yet. It lurked in the grammar. Anakin looked at the temple doors and sensed another presence approaching through the city's veins, scorched and implacable as judgment. Mace lived. The realization hit him like cold water and old guilt, and a chance he had thought he had burned away. The living force did not speak often, and when it did, it refused to flatter certainty. Yoda sat in the dim hold of a stolen shuttle wrapped in blankets of engine vibration and Wookiee breath while the stars wheeled cold beyond the cockpit. Chewie flew. Tarful watched the rear hatch with a vibroblade across his knees and the patience of a mountain. Between them lay crates of salvaged munitions, half a medical kit, and one sedated clone whose chip had been removed under miserable field conditions by trembling hands guided through it from Ahsoka's stolen transmission. The man slept like someone dragged out of deep water, and not yet convinced he would be allowed to keep breathing. Yoda folded into stillness because motion had taken him as far as it could. Ahead lay Corasont and choice. Somewhere behind that choice was the faint, impossible thread he had begun to hear in recent days and dismissed too often as longing. When the voice came, it did not sound like memory. "Too old you are," said Qui-Gon with warmth threaded through mischief and grief alike. Yoda's eyes opened. In the dim cargo hold, the apparition stood with no more solidity than reflected moonlight, and infinitely more presence than most living politicians. Not young, not as he had first been, but not bound by age either. Calm had always fit him badly in life. Beyond life, he wore it with the ease of a man finally allowed to be wholly himself. "Late you are," Yoda said, because even revelation deserved honesty. Qui-Gon smiled faintly. "I've been shouting through half the galaxy. You've had other things on your mind." Eesh. Yoda looked at him, old friend and old argument, and allowed himself one breath of relief so deep it bordered on pain. "Broken, everything is." "No," said the spirit gently. "Everything hidden is showing itself. That's not the same thing." Below them, the wounded clone stirred in sleep and whispered for someone unnamed. Chewie glanced back once, sensed without understanding, and returned his attention to the stars. "The Sith planned a blade," Yoda said. "Cut deep, it did. It did. But the hand that threw it believed itself infallible." Qui-Gon's gaze turned, somehow, toward a city many parsecs away. There's still room for choice. That's what he forgot. That's always what they forget. Anakin burned in Yoda's awareness at the center of that truth. Not lost. Not safe. The distinction mattered. "Help him. I cannot from here." "You may not need to." Qui-Gon's form flickered, then steadied. The boy doesn't need one more master trying to force him toward virtue. He needs someone to keep the door open long enough for him to walk through it. "No." Yoda thought of Obi-Wan, of patience forged into love. He thought of Padme, who had always understood the living, beating heart beneath Anakin's failures better than the Order had. He thought, reluctantly, of Mace, whose severity had at times been justice, and at times fear wearing noble robes. The galaxy was full of people who had tried to guide Anakin by pulling. Few had tried by waiting. "And Sidious?" Yoda asked. Qui-Gon's eyes, always so alive in argument, turned grave. "He's frightened now. That will make him crueler. It will also make him careless. Fear narrows vision. You know that." "No-ye." "Ah." Then the spirit was gone, leaving only the soft hum of engines and the ache of truth arriving too late to be easy. Yoda bowed his head, not in worship but in acceptance. Ahead, Corasont expanded in the viewport, a crown of light wrapped around darkness. In another lane of that same approach, Obi-Wan flew Grievous' stolen starfighter through military traffic so dense and erratic that half the sky seemed at war with itself. Republic transponders challenged him. Senate overrides contradicted them. Civilian vessels veered from sealed sectors. Twice he had to cut through freight corridors to avoid gunship formations racing toward or away from the Temple District. Each channel he touched carried the same thing in new wording: the Chancellor's claim, Bael's rebuttal, Ahsoka's proof of the chips, frightened eyewitnesses, confused officers, the beginning of a public struggle for narrative, in a city that had always confused narrative with power. He turned the fighter toward the temple and felt the hour contract. Anakin had gone inside. Not as executioner. Not cleanly. The temple still lived too loudly for that. But he was within its halls now, and that meant the choice had entered sacred ground. The bronze doors had opened under his authority after all, because the temple had been built to welcome him and had not yet learned how to refuse. He had passed through an antechamber lined with guards who had known him since boyhood, passed through shield glare and smoke and the eyes of clones outside, past Bael's accusation and Padme's presence hovering just beyond the threshold of sight. No one had attacked him. That was the cruelest mercy. They believed his hesitation meant rescue. Children's voices reached him from a side corridor. He followed them because not to follow would have required more deliberate cruelty than he possessed in that moment. The chamber beyond had once been used for early lightsaber drills. Practice emitters hung dormant in the walls. Training circles marked the polished floor. A half-dozen younglings and 2 older students had been brought there to await escort deeper into the temple, because the main sanctuary routes were compromised. When Anakin entered, every face turned toward him and relief bloomed with such simple force he nearly staggered under it. "Master Skywalker," one little girl said, and smiled. He had seen armies charge with less trust. His hand tightened on his lightsaber hilt until the knuckles ached. Sidious's command echoed in him, not because the Sith could control him from afar, but because once spoken, some orders kept speaking with your own voice until answered. End the old order. Leave no one behind who can become an enemy. Do what must be done for Padme. For the future. For the power to prevent loss. Anakin looked at the children. One had tear tracks dried white on dark cheeks. Another clutched a training saber with both hands and was plainly trying to stand in front of the younger ones despite shaking hard enough to make the blade tip tap against her boot. The oldest student, perhaps 14, had stepped forward protectively and was failing to hide how frightened he was. They were not enemies. They were the lie exposed. Behind Anakin, outside the chamber, the temple trembled as another impact struck the outer stairs. Public speech, military order, civil panic, the ancient building's own defenses, all of it seemed to exist at an impossible distance from the small room where children waited to discover what kind of man had come through the door. He heard footsteps in the corridor behind him. Padme. He knew it before she spoke, knew it with the terrible relief of a drowning man hearing shore. She had disobeyed every sensible instruction and followed him into the heart of the crisis, because love had never once in her life mistaken caution for virtue when the two came into conflict. Anakin. Only his name. Nothing else. No accusation first, no plea, no performance of politics or righteousness. Just his name, offered as if he were still capable of belonging to it. He turned. She stood at the threshold in smoke-dim light, cloak dark around her shoulders, face drawn with fear and resolve. Bail was somewhere behind her, wisely out of sight. Temple guards held back. Even they understood that this was no longer a military problem alone. For one long second, Anakin simply looked at her. Every argument Sidious had built in him trembled under that gaze, because she was the reason for all of them, and the only being present who had never once asked him to become less than himself in order to deserve love. Padme's eyes dropped once, briefly, to the children, then came back to him. She understood at once. He saw her understand, and saw the grief that followed close behind. "You came to protect them," she said softly. It was not true, not wholly, but it was a future spoken aloud, and that made it possible. "I came because I didn't know what else to do," he said. Honesty sounded ragged in him, as if unused. That's not the same as not knowing what's right. Outside, in the Western service approaches, Mace reached the side lift with the young clone at his shoulder, just as temple personnel cracked the entrance for them. The guards' blades came up, then halted in shock. Mace did not slow. Pain made every step expensive. He paid anyway. On final approach above the district, Obi-Wan felt the new presence inside the temple, and understood with dizzying gratitude and dread that Mace had survived. At almost the same instant, he felt Yoda's shuttle drop from hyperspace into the system with old purpose blazing at its center, and something quieter beside it, like wisdom long delayed finally choosing to arrive. The city had become a web of converging wills. Inside the training chamber, one of the youngest children reached for Anakin's free hand because children assume the best until reality teaches them otherwise. He looked down at the tiny fingers. He deactivated his lightsaber and let it hang at his side. The room breathed. It was the smallest possible rebellion. No public declaration. No noble speech. No clean redemption. Only one man, standing at the hinge of history, refusing for 1 second more, to become the murderer his fear had promised would save the world. On the stairs outside, the chip-ridden troopers chose that same second to force the assault without him. Utapau, bleeding and furious, turned his men against them. Temple shields flared. Clone fired on clone under the banners of a republic that had ceased to know itself. Across Corasont, public trust split like struck glass. In the Senate Tower, some beings applauded Sidious's hard new order, while others listened to contradictory evidence and felt the first raw tremor of resistance. In the lower districts, ordinary citizens began to hide fugitives they had never met, because the official story had developed too fast and smelled too much like fear. Aboard the shuttle nearing the city, Yoda opened his eyes and looked toward the capital. "Still choice there is," he said. Chewie growled agreement, though he could not know the word's full weight. Qui-Gon's absence felt, for the first time, less like loss than like direction. And in the temple where bells still tolled and children still waited and love had arrived before certainty could finish killing what remained of conscience, Anakin closed his fingers around the small hand offered to him and looked at Padme as if he had been falling for years and had only just seen the ground rising to meet him. Outside, the night over Corasont burned red. Inside, the Empire failed to be born cleanly. And because it failed to be born cleanly, the galaxy lived long enough to choose what it would become next.